Hi, and welcome back to Mastering Your Fertility YouTube TV. You are watching episode 37, where we interview Lara Adler, who is a certified health coach and then also an environmental toxin expert. So the reason we sought her out is because we wanted to learn more about environmental toxins and how it affects fertility. So this episode is absolutely amazing. It's one of my top 3. I absolutely loved hearing from her, and just the way that she explains things about toxins is calming and not overwhelming. It's also kind of shocking, but you can kind of take it in small doses and feel like you walked away with just so much new information and actionable steps. And so I think you're going to feel the same way when you listen to this. She's just a wealth of knowledge. Absolutely love the episode. So some of the things that we talk about is debunking some of the misconceptions around toxic exposure. One of those misconceptions is that you have to be exposed to a lot of one thing for it to make an effect. And that's just not the case. She talks about how our endocrine system communicates in small whispers and just little whispers. And basically what that means is just a little tiny bit can mess up the communication between your hormones. And of course, making a baby is all about hormones. It's synchronicity around your hormonal endocrine system. And so if anything is off there, if you're getting exposed to something, even just a small amount, that can lead to fertility issues and problems and potentially miscarriage or even pregnancy complications. And then we also talk about how it affects generations down the line. And so when you're exposed, when you're exposing your growing baby in utero, there's a lot of research that is showing how that affects their fertility as they become an adult. And then who knows down the line what that's affecting their children. And so it's just this ongoing compounding effect that really needs to be taken a hard look at. And we need to get serious about this because it's really going to affect our future generations if we don't do something about it. They've actually already named a syndrome called phthalate syndrome, which is when it's feminizing the male genitals. And so there's actual toxic exposure effects in utero that is being seen physically with male genitals. So it's pretty scary, people. So
now that we've scared the crap out of you,
yeah.
What's great about this episode is that it's very actionable, and she has a lot of, she does this for a living. She actually educates other healthcare professionals about how to discuss toxicity with their clients and how to do it in a way that feels approachable and actionable. Yeah. So it's not super scary. She has a ton of great advice of how to reduce exposure to these things. So if you already know that you have a bunch of exposures, the great news is that once you start reducing and eliminating some of these things just by really simple, not super expensive steps in your daily life, your blood and urine levels of these toxic chemicals actually plummets rapidly. And they've done studies on that. So there's a lot of hope for how to reduce these things. And we give you a ton of actionable ways to do that in the episode. So let's go ahead and introduce Lara to you. We'll go ahead and read her bio here for you really quick. So Lara Adler is an environmental toxins expert and educator and a certified holistic health coach who teaches health coaches, nutritionists, and other holistic health practitioners how to eliminate the number one thing holding their clients back from the results they're seeking, the unaddressed link between chemicals and chronic health problems. She trains practitioners to become experts in everyday toxic exposures so that they can improve client outcomes without spending hundreds of hours researching on their own. Combining environmental health education and business consulting, she's helped thousands of health professionals in over 25 countries around the world elevate their skill set, get better results for their clients, and become sought-out leaders in the growing environmental health and detoxification field. Lara is a member of the Naturopathic Association of Environmental Medicine and the American Holistic Health Association. So we're very excited to share this interview with you this week, and we hope you enjoy it. All right. Welcome, Lara Adler. Thank you so much for joining us on the Mastering Your Fertility podcast today.
Thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm excited to share with you guys.
Yeah, this is a great topic. We've talked about it kind of periodically on the podcast. We have one episode already on like personal care products, but there's a much bigger pool out there when we're talking about environmental toxins. So we're really excited to dig into this.
Great.
So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in environmental toxins, as well as training other practitioners on toxins?
Yeah. So, I tell this story a lot, and I usually say it kind of happened on accident. And I jokingly say, no little kid is sitting in a room like dreaming of one day teaching about toxins. Like, it's not one of those type of jobs. I sort of fell into it. I always had a personal fascination and interest in health and nutrition from, my, early teen years, which at this point feels like a very, very, very long time ago, but was always interested in health and nutrition and didn't really consider it to be something that I would pursue professionally. So I kind of went down this other avenue, had a whole other career in another industry, and kind of kept coming back to this idea of working with people around nutrition at the time. And so I explored what the opportunities were at the time, which was, health coaching was something that kind of caught my eye as like, oh, here's a way that I can kind of scratch this nerdy itch I have about nutrition and health and wellness and help people. And it's like a more rewarding profession than what I was doing in like corporate sales. And so I went down that path. I got certified as a health coach. I started seeing clients, and I, realized that some of my clients were having really great success with most of my clients were coming to me for weight loss. And others had like no success, like nothing happened. And I felt very, responsible to figure out why. And it was really through that experience that led me into this path of looking at what are the underlying factors that I might be missing that might be related to resistant weight loss. And it was through that research that I sort of stumbled into this world of environmental health, and it just blew my hair back because at that point I'd already been immersing myself in this health and wellness space for at least a decade at that point. And this was really the first time I was hearing about this environmental component to chronic illness. We talked about diet, we talked about exercise, we talked about stress, but this piece wasn't really talked about. Now, at the same time that was happening, my sister-in-law was pregnant with my niece. And so I was really ultra concerned about like, what is she buying? What are the products that she's using? And I started researching, things like water filters and babies' mattresses and things like that. And again, it just super blew my hair back as to like, I can't even believe that this is a thing that we're talking about, but it's a thing. And so I spent about 2 years diving into all the literature that I could get my hands on environmental health and these, chronic low dose exposures to toxicants that we're getting every single day, and how that's connected to all of these sort of modern day ailments that people are having. And it was fascinating to me. And because I was a health coach at the time, I was surrounded by other health coaches. So I had this community of colleagues, and all of them were kind of knocking on my door going like, I don't know anything about this stuff, and I feel like I should. And so that's really what turned my attention to working with the practitioner audience, because there's an enormous education gap in this conversation across all modalities. So for example, in the nutrition space, we get really frazzled and sort of annoyed and irritated when we hear that the average medical doctor has between 19 and 21 hours of nutrition training during their entire medical career. And we're like, that's insane. In the environmental health space, the average medical doctor has between 0 and 7 hours of training in this entire conversation. And most of that training hovers around occupational exposure. So high doses of exposures to certain types of chemicals. They're not looking at what are referred to as environmentally relevant doses, which is like, what are we exposed to every day just through living our normal everyday lives? And so that's kind of how I got here. I've been doing this teaching since 2012. And it's been really rewarding because, as you guys know, especially even with this fertility conversation, the topic of toxins is getting a bigger and bigger spotlight on it every year that passes, because it's such a big and important topic. So I'm glad to be here talking about it.
Yeah, it definitely is a big and important topic. And I can kind of attest to the fact that, we're missing this education in a lot of modalities in natural health. I mean, in my nutrition training, we studied diet and lifestyle and movement, extensively, but we really didn't talk that much about toxins. And I'm kind of surprised at how little knowledge I really had, especially from a fertility perspective, on some of these like endocrine disrupting things that are out there that are really significantly affecting people. And we just didn't really cover that in our training. So there are a lot of chemicals registered for use in the United States. So how many chemicals are actually out there that we're, potentially exposed to, or that are like kind of basically on the market?
So there's not actually an exact figure that people know. There's some big numbers that are thrown around. So globally, it's estimated that there's about 100,000 to 150,000 chemicals in use. In the United States, there's about 84,000 that are registered for use, although the Environmental Protection Agency just recently they finally did an analysis of like what is actually being used, because amazingly, up until earlier this year, the EPA didn't track this information. Like,
wow,
they didn't actually know. And so what they found is that of that 84,000 that are registered for use, there's about 40,000 that are actively being currently used, although I always kind of take that information with a bit of a grain of salt, because it requires transparency on the part of industry, and industry is not always transparent. So there's about 84,000 chemicals registered for use in the United States. We, up until very recently, we've had no legal requirement for chemicals to be tested for safety prior to coming to market, which is why we just have this massive black hole of lack of information on most of the chemicals that are in commerce, that are in the products that we buy and use every day. There's about 200 that have a fairly robust set of data around safety, but even that I kind of put a little asterisk and say sort of, because that robust, quote unquote, robust safety testing is done on high dose exposures. They're not done on chronic low dose exposures. Almost none of the safety testing data that we have is actually on the real life way that we are being exposed. And so there's a big disconnect between what the federal government says is safe based on safety testing data and what's actually safe. So it's a big chemical soup that we're swimming in.
And why do you think that is? Like, why aren't there more studies on this?
There's a really good, that's a big question. So I think that what we're seeing is a product of poor government regulation that is in itself a product of industry influence, because industry obviously does not want to have higher regulations on their product. And this is where we get a lot of the politicization, it's a hard word to say, of this conversation, because it's all about like how much hand of government do we have in regulating products, and do we want free market capitalism to reign and that will solve the problem. And so, it sort of elevates the conversation to a different level. But fundamentally, I think the reason why the U.S. government doesn't regulate chemicals as strongly or in a more restrictive fashion like the European Union does is because we don't have centralized healthcare. And so the burden of cost of exposures to environmental chemicals doesn't fall on the government, whereas in the European Union it does. So there is a financial incentive for them to regulate. Because
I've never heard that point before.
Yeah.
That is so interesting.
Yeah, I've never even thought of that.
It makes a lot of sense.
That fundamentally is why I believe that chemical regulation over here in the United States, we used to lead the charge on environmental policy. The Environmental Protection Agency founded in 1970s, was the first of its kind in the world. And we used to lead the charge, and we have fallen so far behind on environmental policies and chemical regulation. And in my opinion, the big reason is it's all based on healthcare. There was a study that was done, I think it was published in 2016, that looked at just 5% of the known endocrine disrupting chemicals, and there are many, and compared those to some of the more persistent chronic illnesses like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, et cetera, and calculated the healthcare costs. And what they found was that just this 5% sliver of endocrine disrupting chemicals costs the US $341 billion a year in healthcare costs and lost wages because people are sick. And that same calculation in Europe was about, I think it was about a third less, because they more heavily regulate certain chemicals over there that we don't over here. And so that burden of cost is lower.
So would you say that, so people are just using the healthcare system less over in Europe, and so ultimately they're just less affected? Like,
I think it depends on the categories, but yes, generally, like, they are more protected by their regulations than we are, depending on the chemicals. So for example, like in the United States, we have higher levels of flame retardants in our bodies because of specific laws here around flammability, whereas in European Union, many of those chemicals were phased out like a decade ago. And so Europeans have lower levels of those chemicals. But in other categories like pesticides, the Europeans in some cases can have higher levels of certain types of pesticides than we do. So, it's not across the board, but generally they take a far more they take what's called the precautionary principle. And that's their sort of guiding philosophy of how to regulate chemicals over there. Is like, let's better safe than sorry. We don't need 100% scientific proof, because we know in the scientific community that that's generally not even real. Like, that's not possible.
Right.
And so if the, weight of the evidence suggests that a chemical is going to be harmful, they will move to regulate that and restrict its use, or ban its use, whatever is more appropriate. And in the United States, we take an innocent until proven guilty approach. So if it's so toxic, then sue us. And the problem with that mindset is that, we're trying to sue, because you can't sue an industry, right? You sue a company. And the company is not solely responsible for your exposure to chemical X or chemical Y. Unless, for example, we're talking about glyphosate and Monsanto, they're the only company that makes it. So yes, we can point a finger at a company. But if we're going to sue, Procter & Gamble for having phthalates in their shampoos, we can't just sue them, because phthalates are in thousands of other products. And so it becomes an impossible burden for somebody who's wanting to take legal action, which is why we just don't see them that many, and why when we do see them, like the Johnson & Johnson case with talcum powder, or the recent settlements against Bayer Monsanto for the glyphosate use, they make big news, because it's not that often that we see this David and Goliath where, David wins.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's amazing to me how difficult it is to get something taken off the market, even after there's like all of this scientific evidence that it's harmful.
Yes.
Things like BPA, things like phthalates that have a massive body of evidence behind them. And yet these things have still not been regulated or removed from consumer products. And it's just impossible when something has been approved and it's
a big reason behind that has to do with the way that toxicology testing is done. So the majority of toxicology testing is looking at very certain, very specific endpoints. They're looking at, organ weight, death. They're looking for these sort of cancer development. They're looking for these high endpoints, and toxicology studies typically start with a very high dose, like thousands and thousands of times higher than what we would normally be exposed to. And then they kind of extrapolate down and go, okay, let's just stop when we don't see any other effects, and we're just going to call it a day and not test anything lower than that, even though that lower end of the spectrum of exposures is what we're actually getting. And so the toxicology is really they follow this sort of dose makes the poison. In order for something to be toxic, you have to be exposed to a large quantity of it. and low doses are not effective, don't have an effect on the body. And all of our regulatory decisions are based on that traditional toxicology. And so that's why we're seeing that big gap, is because, the federal government is looking at these toxicology studies, which are really only looking at one side of the spectrum of exposures. So, not all chemicals are going to have, some chemicals may in fact have a more toxic effect at a high dose. But as it pertains to this conversation that we're having, particularly around fertility, when we get into the realm of endocrine disruption, it kind of flips the whole script on the dose makes the poison, because we know that our hormones communicate with each other. The way that I describe it is, our hormones are communication messengers, and they communicate in whispers. It's very quiet. It's very little. There's no shouting in here. And so when we are exposed to really low levels of endocrine disruptors, they're communicating at that same frequency. And a different effect, if you have a really, really high dose of an exposure to an endocrine disruptor, may not actually have any effect on you, or the effect might be different. But, from a regulatory standpoint, they're ignoring what happens in this low dose realm. And there's a new push in the environmental health space to re-examine that. But there's also a lot of resistance from toxicology, because they're going to go, this is how we've always done things. This is the way. We know the way. We're the experts in everything. And there's a lot of ego that's built into that. And then, I love this conversation because it's scratching all my nerd itches. Then we get into, a specific manufacturer or an industry is unlikely to ever admit that a low dose is going to be harmful, because then it calls into question the safety of their products for all the previous decades, which opens them up to lawsuits.
Yeah.
Right? So they're not going to admit it. They're just going to go, well, according to the federal government, it's safe.
Mm-hmm. So this kind of brings up a funny thing that I keep seeing in commercials, because a lot of companies are kind of trying to capitalize on this more educated consumer base. And so you've got, companies like fast food joints going now made with 100% real beef, or,
before.
So, yeah, exactly. So now Subway bread doesn't have this weird chemical in it that people freaked out because it was used in yoga mats or something. And whenever I see that kind of marketing, I don't go, oh, yay, that's so great. I go, oh my God, what was I eating before?
What were you doing to us before?
Yeah, that kind of freaks me out. Okay. So you're kind of hitting on some of the misconceptions about toxins in general. So that one big misconception is that the dose makes the poison, in terms of bigger doses cause the effect, smaller doses don't. What are kind of some of the other misconceptions that you see, either practitioners having misconceptions, consumers having misconceptions? What are some of the myths about toxins?
I definitely think the biggest one for me is always the dose makes the poison. And what I say to that is that it's true but partial, because there's absolutely things that follow that model of the dose, or that dose response curve of higher doses equal a bigger effect. So it's true but partial. It's not fully the full picture. So that's one. The other one is, and we sort of touched on this already, is that most consumers, I believe, or I think still believe that the products wouldn't be for sale if they weren't tested and if they weren't safe. And so there's this big misconception about the degree to which our consumer products are vetted for safety and have gone through, they assume that there's some, master approval process and everything has to be tested for safety. And that's just not true. I think another myth is about ingredient disclosure. So people just think first of all, I'll say, as it pertains to ingredients and product labeling, is that most people look to the front of the package for their information, not the back of the package. So the front of the package is there to sell us. Mm-hmm. The back of it's not there to inform us. The back of the package is where the information is, asterisk, sometimes, except when it's not. And so a lot of people don't recognize or don't realize that in, for example, with household cleaners and those types of products, there's no requirement for ingredient disclosure. They don't have to tell you what's in it. And
Wow.
so people are very much in the dark. I think another big myth is that natural products don't work as well. I see this where there's resistance for people kind of adopting these new, products that are maybe beauty products or household cleaners. They're like, oh, they don't work as well. And it's not true anymore.
I actually have a story about that real quick because this happened to me. I fell into that myth, but I have stainless steel in my kitchen and it drives me crazy because now I have a toddler and she puts her hands all over the stainless steel and they're like just streaked and gross all the time. So at least once a week I have to go and like clean my stainless steel off. So I went to the store and I got stainless steel wipes. They sold me on the front of the package and said, this is going to clean your stainless steel. And I was like, great. Okay. So disclosure, this was about a year ago. So I would use those wipes. And then recently though, I was like, oh my gosh, I need to figure out a better way. Right. So I finally Googled it and I was like, how do you clean stainless steel naturally? And it was so easy. It was white vinegar, like non-diluted white vinegar. And you just clean your stainless steel with non-diluted white vinegar. And then you wipe it off with a dry towel. And it worked so well that I felt like an idiot. So I was like, I can't believe that I, first of all, spent money on like an actual store product.
Right.
So yeah.
Let alone a toxic store product.
But yes, exactly. And, I think in the, to your question about, misconception around practitioners is that, these, again, I think there's this idea that, oh, well, if there's not occupational exposures, it's not really relevant. And the reality is that, this chronic low dose exposure that we're getting to hundreds of chemicals, even in a single day, but throughout our lives, in the literature is linked to literally every single health issue that we are experiencing, whether it's eczema or autoimmune issues, which is eczema, or allergies or asthma, or autism, Alzheimer's, dementia, heart disease, diabetes, cancer, like everything. And so it's a massive, sort of like the elephant in the room. Dr. Joseph Pizzorno, who's a sort of founder of Bastyr University, a leading physician in the environmental medicine space, says that toxicity is the primary driver of disease. Like it is the underlying driver of disease. And when you look at the incidence rates of a lot of the chronic illnesses, you see that they all start to kind of uptick around the same period of time. And that's really when, we have this big push towards producing these synthetic chemicals. And some of these chemicals are so persistent that, we are still finding banned chemicals that were banned 30, 40 years ago in umbilical cord blood of newborn babies now. And so, we have to do everything that we can to, as consumers, to shift our purchases, and that shifting of our purchases as consumers ultimately will shift the marketplace, because industry is never going to get regulated from government. It's going to respond to consumer demand. That's how industry changes.
Totally agree.
So
definitely.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So as far as fertility goes specifically, I know that you mentioned earlier that the dose matters and that, the higher doses is what's being studied, but in fertility specifically, you mentioned how low doses can really make a huge difference. Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, first of all, it depends on, where in this sort of preconception, fertility, conception, fetal development spectrum that we're on. But we know that fertility is a hormone-driven process in the body. It's just that's how we reproduce, is through the sort of delicate communication between our hormones. And we have exposure to all of these endocrine disrupting chemicals that really mess with the sort of thermostat of our system, and can really, they can affect fertility in dozens of different ways. They can, there was an article, I think it was last year, that came out by The Intercept. The Intercept has been doing a very very amazing piece, long running piece. There's got to be like 27 plus pieces to this story on perfluorinated chemicals. And they had one of the articles in that series was about how PFAS chemicals, these are these perfluoroalkyl substances, can damage sperm. And so that's where we're seeing fertility on that end. But we also have, you know, everything from bisphenol A to mercury to lead exposure to flame retardants that can disrupt different facets of our endocrine system. So a lot of the chemicals that we're exposed to suppress thyroid function. And we know that optimal thyroid function is really critical, especially in fetal development, but you know, even before then, also in just sort of regulating the preconception health. And so, you know, I think that unfortunately we are not experiencing an effect from one angle. So there's lots of different ways that these environmental chemicals can alter our fertility, can reduce fertility, can interfere with our, I'm trying to remember what the specific chemical is that alters the FSH hormone. I think it's BPA. I can't remember exactly. I don't want to misquote. And then that in and of itself just plummets fertility. We also have exposures that are happening in utero and throughout childhood that can affect fertility later in life. And so this is where it's like, well, what we were exposed to in the womb can determine our fertility issues now, which
Right.
is you know, we really have to start thinking more generations out than we have.
Yeah, that is like the scariest thing to me is that, you know, even if we're switching things around, you know, in this generation, we're still going to be seeing the effects
Yes.
of these exposures for maybe even several generations to come. I mean, you know, there's also epigenetic effects and like how we're actually programming our babies in utero and these exposures. I mean, we don't even have all of the data to say everything that these exposures could potentially do. I mean, we have some data to suggest that there are certain exposures that can affect children long-term and maybe even impact, you know, fertility in females and even males too. I mean, we've got like phthalates and urogenital defects in men and testicular size. And I mean, it's really scary.
Yeah. And I think that that's actually, you know, from a fertility standpoint, very interesting and also a really challenging topic to talk about is the way that these exposures in utero, just like you were saying with these, you know, phthalates, et cetera, that are changing male genital development and that are shortening the anogenital distance, which is a marker of feminization. And so what we're seeing is a more feminized male population who have smaller penis sizes, undescended testicles at birth. Sometimes they're born with hypospadias. This is all referred to as phthalate syndrome, this sort of cluster of syndromes that little baby boys have. And all of that and that shorter anogenital distance, they're all markers of feminization. And so those boys are going to have reduced fertility as they reach adulthood. And so there's a lot of implications to this exposure to these endocrine disrupting chemicals. Many of them lean towards the estrogenic side of the spectrum, which is why we're seeing this feminization, physiological feminization in males. And so it's a big issue. And then, you know, we also have, you know, this sort of early development exposure to these endocrine disrupting chemicals for girls. And what we're finding for them is, you know, they're having early onset puberty, a lot of them. So age of puberty is dropping for girls. And that in and of itself is a marker for increased risk of breast cancer, because a woman's risk of breast cancer is directly related to how many years she's been exposed to estrogen. And if you start your period or you start puberty, I should say, earlier than your peers, then you're now added a year or two or whatever it is, more time where you're being exposed to these estrogenic compounds, natural or otherwise. And so there's all of these sort of health implications that spider out, that sort of spider web out. And, what I've really, the fetal human is the most sensitive. So women that are dealing with preconception, that are trying to work on optimizing their fertility, like this is the most important audience to start looking at environmental exposures, period, end of story. Because you're building a human being, or you're working to try to get your body ready to build a human being. And we have to start looking at toxicity long before conception happens. And for people that are struggling with conception, it's very likely that toxicity is a big part of why. Like if your body is not ready or capable of creating a viable human, then there's a reason for that. And toxicity is probably a reason, probably a big part of that story. And so, I really believe that backing up sort of detox way, way, way early in the process is important. And if anybody's bumping into a sort of fertility hurdle, that they spend time doing a deep detox first. And I have a good friend who, her first 2 babies were IVF babies because she, and then we all know that's how expensive and that is, and how much of an ordeal that is. And, both of her daughters have health issues because they just, she just wasn't optimal. And it was because of her daughter's health issues that she turned into the sort of more natural, holistic, integrative side of things. And after making, she's just she called me from, Home Depot going, oh my God, what do I buy? What do I do? We're renovating, like this, every single question,
get out.
every question got, and her third child was conceived naturally after 2 IVF babies. And she, at 40,
wow.
It was like, you can't have, they were like, your eggs are old. You can't have babies. You have fertility issues. And she's like, oops, how'd that happen? And he's like super robust, super healthy. And, like that was she credits this massive change in her lifestyle and really detoxing her whole lifestyle with completely shifting how her body perceived the environment that it was in. Like, okay, this is a safe environment to make a kid.
Yeah. Well, and this is, you mentioned this is like the most important time to intervene, but it's also the most important time to intervene from that generational perspective, because we're going to be not only creating a better environment for those kids, but then those kids are going to grow up in a better environment and be able to make a better environment for their kids. And then, parents who are educated about this can educate their kids about it. And, I think consumer awareness and acceptance of this as a major issue in our society is one of the things that's kind of holding us back from getting there faster, with the consumer demand.
Yeah. And, I'll say that it has been really exciting to see the level of fluency among consumers expand. It's still definitely not where it needs to be. And it's, maybe within certain pockets of the health-minded and mom-minded community. Yes, they're more sort of tuned into this, but, the average American, the average person doesn't know anything about these exposures. It doesn't even dawn on them that, the couch that they're sitting on or the shampoo that they're using or what they're using to clean their bathroom has anything to do with any of their health issues. And I think that's a consumer and a sort of public education gap that we need to fill. But, that's really why I work with health professionals, because it's like that. If I can educate all them and then they can go out and share this with all of their clients and patients, then that's a more efficient method of getting this information out than me trying to do that on my own.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to ask, I imagine some of our listeners are like, well, how serious do I really need to be about this? Like either I'm healthy or I don't feel like I have any symptoms, or maybe they're just wondering like what symptoms might be clues that they're toxic or that they're being too exposed.
It's a good question. That's hard to answer because it's all of them.
Right.
But it's like, it's every symptom, right? Because, and the thing is So, these toxic exposures same toxic exposure can affect two different people differently.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really all about like, where is your sort of weak link, where you have susceptibility, what kind of exposures do you have? And so, the question about like, am I toxic? The answer is just yes. So the CDC does human biomonitoring studies. They've been doing this for decades. These studies are really just there to establish the presence of, chemicals in people. And they've measured over 300 industrial chemicals in people. And some of these chemicals are in, 93, 95, 98% of the population. So we're all exposed. And so I don't ask the question like, are we toxic? The answer is like, are we symptomatic yet? And unfortunately, when it comes to toxic exposures, the latency between exposures and health effect can be a couple of decades. So it might take 20 or 30 years for us to finally manifest this breast cancer or autoimmune condition or infertility, right? But it's been this slow burn this whole while, and we just haven't noticed it, or the symptoms have been so subtle that we dismiss them. Oh, I'm really tired all the time lately. Well, that's brain fog, or, just an energy production problem. Most of the environmental chemicals that we're exposed to damage our mitochondria. Our mitochondria are what produce energy for us. So, there's no symptom like, oh, my hair is falling out, my skin is getting really dry. Well, maybe that's a thyroid issue. Maybe it's because you've been exposing yourself to thyroid altering chemicals for the last 10 years and it's finally catching up with you. So there's really no single symptom where you can go, oh, that's somebody's toxic. It's any health issue, even things like gut issues. So there's all this new research into the world of gut health and the microbiome. And there's all these environmental chemicals that alter the microbiome in ways that can really lead to the sort of proliferation of these sort of bad bugs that we don't want, that are causing all of these health issues and food cravings and sleep issues and all these other hormone imbalances. And so it doesn't really matter what the health effect is. There's very likely a toxic component because unfortunately we are still all exposed. And my goal is really to get people to start dialing down that exposure as much as possible, to like kind of clear out the noise of things that are adding sort of gasoline to the fire. I know I'm mixing my metaphors here, but that we just really want to start dialing down those exposures as much as possible. I usually tell a story about like being in a rowboat and having that boat having a little hole in the bottom, and it's starting to fill up with water. And most people are, a little bit of water is not such a big deal. Everybody's got a little bit of water in their boat, not a big deal. At a certain point, it becomes too much. And, it sort of overwhelms us and our boat sinks and we drown, i.e. we develop some kind of health issue. And the first step in a real life situation, if you were in a boat with a hole in it, would be to plug the dang hole. Just plug the hole, stop this garbage from coming in. And that's really the goal here, is if we can start reducing our exposures to what's coming into the body through simple steps like getting rid of, plastics in the kitchen, cleaning up your personal care products, cleaning up your household cleaners, taking off your shoes, dusting and vacuuming, which I recognize like nobody wants to do. I don't want to do it. But dusting and vacuuming like there's been research that shows that if you increase dusting and vacuuming the right way, you can reduce exposures to flame retardants. Well, that's important. Buying products that are not going to be continuously adding to this sort of water in your boat that might cause it to sink. So we want to empty that as much as possible. So I really try to approach it from the sort of two-pronged perspective of, one is dialing down exposures while increasing excretion. So while optimizing, that's optimizing your nutrition, that's making sure that people are sweating through sauna therapy, because sauna is a great way to detoxify some of these chemicals that we're exposed to, and making sure that you're pooping every day. Gotta poop every day. That's us detoxing. And
For
so
sure.
we're dialing down exposure while increasing our body's capacity to excrete what we are exposed to and what we can't avoid, because we cannot avoid everything.
Yeah, we definitely can't avoid everything. That's so frustrating to me. Like I guess it's like a type A control freak. It just, it bothers me that it's allowed, you know, that companies are allowed to produce things and expose me to things. And I literally can't escape. Like there's nothing I can do about certain exposures. Like I can be as diligent about it and as vigilant about it as I possibly can. But, you know, even the most aware person is still going to have exposure. And that just pisses me off.
Yeah. And I agree. And I've been doing this for 10 years now. So 100% agree with that. And the, approach that I take is, let's change the things that we can control so we worry less about the ones that we can't, because stress is also toxic.
Definitely.
Right. Well, and so there's that balance between like, what can I do that's not going to make me a crazy, anxious, neurotic person in the world, but that will also decrease my toxic load? Like, where's that balance? And again, like, as I said earlier, all of these small shifts that consumers make where they're going to buy this product instead of that one, it does send a message to these companies and to these industries as a whole. I read a couple of weeks ago an industry analysis of the personal care product industry, and that of this massive, not even just that, just the beauty industry as a whole. And the fastest growing sector of that industry is the natural and organic, because consumers are now at a place in time where they're demanding transparency, and it's shifting the entire landscape of that industry, and that it's millennials that are leading the charge on this, which is so inspiring, because I'm like, there's hope. There's hope.
Well,
young people out and aware, and they're going, how dare you? How dare you mess with my future?
Yeah.
What's interesting about that is that, like, there was just an article that came out about the major health decline that's happening in millennials is starting at age 27.
27.
Well, it started long before that for me, and a lot of us as well, have been in that boat, or we've been chronically ill for a long time. But, I really think that that's a big part of the reason that millennials are, not only do we have more access to information, so we're more aware than previous generations about what we're being exposed to, but we're sicker, and we're just trying to figure out like how to feel better. I think a lot of us are struggling in conventional medical spaces because things like environmental toxins and nutrition are just missing from a lot of the recommendations that we get in that space. Not every doctor, but most of them are just not experienced in advising patients on how to make some of these changes. And so we do a lot of these things. We're getting interested in this space and paying attention to some of these things out of pure necessity.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't really matter what the reason is. The outcome is that it's shifting the landscape, regardless of the reason, it's shifting the landscape. And so that's the silver lining of this situation. It's also why we have, millions of young people, going to the streets and protesting about climate change, because they're like, guys, we're the ones that are going to have to deal with this. Like, you're going to be dead soon, and then it's going to be just us. So please don't leave us with this like steaming dumpster fire of a planet. We're the ones that are going to inherit this. And so I think it's that same sort of push from younger people to pay more attention to their environment as a whole, whether it's stemming from a sort of a more wide scale climate change conversation, or if it's like, hey, none of my friends are having an easy time getting pregnant. What's going on? We're all in our 20s. Yeah. So, whatever is the issue, when we're seeing fertility, we do see fertility rates that are just plummeting around the world. And it's not unique to this country. We have to start looking in a bigger capacity at these environmental exposures that we're getting every single day. And, the reality is, and I like to share this too, because I recognize fully that this whole conversation can be and feel overwhelming, is that these small changes do matter. And so there's been a number of intervention studies that shows like what actually happens to the blood levels of these chemicals when people change their habits. What happens? And all of these studies have shown that there is a very significant drop in these chemicals within a really short amount of time for certain chemicals. when people change their habits. So for example, there's a number of studies that have looked at what happens when people shift from a conventional diet to a mostly organic diet, not even 100% because that's just hard. And these studies found that people can drop their circulating pesticide levels. That's the levels of, organophosphate, pesticides, et cetera, that are found in serum by 80 to 90% in 3 to 5 days. Super fast.
Wow.
Super fast. And so that's us plugging the hole, right? We're stopping the stuff from coming into the body. And if we support the body in excreting these things out by pooping, by sweating, by making sure that we're hydrated, by, eating the nutrient dense foods that our livers need in order to actually metabolize and detoxify these compounds, we can see a dramatic reduction. There was another study called the Hermosa study that was looking at teenage girls and their use of personal care products. And they were measuring things like phthalates and parabens and triclosan, which is an antibacterial ingredient that messes with your thyroid, in personal care products. And within, I think it was 5 days or 7 days after switching to products that did not include these ingredients, they saw like a 30 to 40-ish% drop. And my hunch is that had those girls also cleaned up their household cleaners and their laundry detergents and the scented candles, that drop would have been more significant. But they just looked at personal care products. And we know that those same chemicals are in other places. And so that's really huge. And then the study, or the thing that I referenced a few minutes ago, is that a study was done on women who using intervention on hand washing and vacuuming, and found that regular hand washing and regular vacuuming, when you increase that, you actually decrease the levels of flame retardants. And that was what they were measuring in the study. But flame retardants are found in dust.
Right.
And so this dust in our homes is actually a huge receptacle for environmental toxins. And they found that within a really short amount of time, those levels started to decrease. So this just goes to show us that, Kristen, all those interventions that you've been doing, all those things that you've been doing, they do actually help. They do actually work to decrease your overall body burden of chemicals. And so I like to share that some of these lifestyle interventions can actually result in a dramatic decrease in your exposures immediately. It's not true for all exposures, but it certainly is for some. And I'm going to take that silver lining where I can get it.
So I was going to ask you a question about, because you were talking about feeling overwhelmed and how this can feel like it's just too much. Where do I even start? I know that it takes a while to finally get to a point where you feel like you've changed a lot of the major exposures. And so people are, I think, used to hearing about like personal care products and cleaning products and plastics in their kitchen. But what are some other hidden exposures? You mentioned a few of them that I was like, I don't think people really know about those, that you've noticed that are pretty big exposures that people are just like completely unaware of. So I have a few in mind, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah. So I would definitely put water at the top of that list. Unfortunately, our water in the United States is heavily contaminated with industrial chemicals, agricultural chemicals, heavy metals. And, as I say, while we don't have things like typhoid and dysentery and cholera in our water anymore, thanks to chlorination and increased sanitation, the trade-off of that has been that we have all these chemicals. And again, it's not, the levels of chemicals in the water is extremely low, but we are drinking it every day, all day throughout our entire lives. And those exposures can be significant. We've seen, what happened in Flint, Michigan. That was not an isolated case. There were many studies around cities around the country that actually had higher levels of lead in their water than Flint. We have these perfluorinated compounds that are showing up in our water. We have atrazine, which is an herbicide that shows up in 94% of drinking water in the United States. So our drinking water isn't as clean as we think it is, and taste is not how we go. is not how we measure how clean it is. So proper water filtration, I think, is really important. It's usually not the very first thing I recommend people do, because to solve that problem requires a little investment. So, if people have already taken care of their personal care products and they've switched out all the plastics in their kitchen and they've cleaned up all their household cleaners and gotten rid of all the scented candles and air fresheners, if you've checked all those things off your list and you're ready to keep going, looking at water, proper water filtration. And I say proper water filtration because you cannot just go to Home Depot or Target or Lowe's or the internet and be like, I want to buy a water filter, because not all water filters are the same. Not everyone's contaminants are the same, and not every filter takes out every contaminant. And so it's really like this sort of Tetris of like, let me match the filter to the contaminant. And so there's a little bit of research required to properly filter your water. So water is definitely one. I think people underestimate the quality of the air inside their home, or they overestimate it, I should say. So really simple things like, I'm assuming that if people have cleaned up their personal care products, they've also ditched the plugins and the scented candles and all of that stuff. If they haven't, like, that's top of list. But opening your windows, we need to allow for air exchange, because the items in our home that are harder for us to address, like our laminate flooring or our particle board IKEA kitchen cabinets, or all of that, MDF particle board furniture that's off-gassing chemicals, like, that's harder for people to change. And it's frustrating because you're like, well, I just bought that. Now what do I do? Well, at the very least, open your windows. Take off your shoes when you come in the house. These are really small things, that we can do that don't cost a lot of money. Once we've kind of gotten those low-hanging fruits out of the way when it comes to the plastics and the personal care products, actually, I would add even to that beginning stage, organic. So avoiding conventional foods, really cleaning up your diet, like that's sort of number one. It didn't get mentioned, but that's really number one. And that includes, organic pastured meats and dairy. That includes wild caught seafood that's low on the food chain, that doesn't gonna provide mercury or other, PCB contaminants into the body. So that's sort of number one. Then we have all those other things. So if somebody's done all that, then I'd say get your water filtered, ramp up the house cleaning. Serious. Nobody likes it. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Be like the bearer of bad news.
I need to hear too. I clean my house, but I clean it because I aesthetically want it clean, but
yes,
we don't necessarily think that we're cleaning it because it's going to lower our exposure to toxins.
Yes. And, this is how we sort of mitigate these exposures that are more costly to address. So for example, most of our electronics, including our computers and our televisions, have flame retardants in them because they don't want these electrical devices to catch fire and burn your house down, and then you're going to sue the company. So they have flame retardants in the plastic housing, and those flame retardants are not bound, so they kind of migrate out over time and they settle in your dust. Same thing with the flame retardants in your couch or other upholstered furniture. Those things settle out in your dust. And so the dust in there's been a number of dozens of studies on house dust, which is, both boring and fascinating at the same time. Because like, what do you do for a living? I study house dust. But I find it fascinating. So the Silent Spring Institute has been doing house dust studies for a number of years. And they, I think it was 100% of house dust sampled had phthalates in them, and various types of phthalates in them. So, we want to start dusting regularly. And I do not mean a feather duster. We're talking microfiber dusting or wet dusting.
Okay, wet dusting. And then would you recommend wearing some type of like mask while you're dusting, or?
You can. I don't think, you certainly can. It wouldn't hurt. It would only help. I don't know how necessary it is, especially if you're wet dusting. You can wear gloves. There definitely is going to be skin absorption. But again, if you wash your hands right after you've cleaned your house, I think that's a more sort of realistic approach, because again, like, I don't want us to feel like we have to don a hazmat suit every time we do something. So I'm a realist. Like, how can we do this stuff while also being normal people in the world?
Okay.
So, wash our hands, wet dusting. If you can invest in a vacuum cleaner that has a really good quality HEPA filter, that's really key. Most vacuum cleaners don't have HEPA filters, and then it just spews all that dust that you just sucked up back out into your house.
Okay. Question about, I have a patient that is struggling with infertility for about 2 years or so, and they're now moving into a new home. And so I'm like, oh, I recommended an air filter, but do you have any recommendations on particular air filters and like how many they should get if it's a brand new home? That's a pretty big exposure.
Yeah, it's a pretty big exposure. There's a couple of things, and we didn't even get into discussing mold. Mold is a whole other world unto itself. If somebody's already purchased a new home, then it is what it is. But in the home buying process, it's wise for people to do mold testing, especially if they feel like they have mold susceptibility, or chronic symptoms that they can't seem to figure out. Like, it's probably mold.
That will have to be another podcast episode.
Yes, that's all. That's another podcast. But the new construction homes are a real problem, because for a couple of reasons. One is because the materials that are often used in new construction are just saturated with chemicals that are off-gassing, and they will off-gas forever. It's not that they'll off-gas and then you don't smell them anymore and then they're done. And the other reason is because of the way that homes are built now, with energy efficiency being a primary a goal, and that energy efficiency has the sort of negative aspect of trapping all this stuff in your house, so you don't have that really good airflow, which is why I tell people to open their windows. So the heating costs go down, that's great, but it also means that you're trapping all of this stuff in your house. This is why the EPA has found that indoor air can be 5 up to 100 times more polluted than outdoor air, because of all the stuff that's off-gassing and then getting trapped in there. So, but what I would suggest in terms of air filtration, there's a lot of air filters on the market. There's a couple of sort of non-negotiables for air filters that I think are important. One is that they have a true HEPA filter. To me, that's a requirement. The other requirement is they have an activated charcoal component in their filter. That is significant. So I've definitely seen air filters that have this like little 1/2-inch layer of activated charcoal. It's not enough. So the top of the line air filters like Austin Air and IQ Air have a large quantity of activated charcoal.
Okay, mine is that like 1/2 inch you're talking about.
Yeah, so like it's better than nothing, right? So it's better than nothing. And obviously it depends on what's happening in the house. But if your patient is living in a new construction, there's going to be a lot of VOCs. So the HEPA filter is going to grab particulates, but it's the charcoal that handles the VOCs. So if they're in an environment that has high VOCs, that little layer of activated charcoal is not going to be sufficient. And so, unfortunately, these better quality air filters are more expensive. They're like, $700-800 each. And you would need them in, the significant rooms in your house, in your living room, in your bedroom, in your kid's bedroom, if there's children in the house. And so it's an investment, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah, I would agree. So, I mean, you just bought a house, you can invest a couple more $1,000 and make 100%, sure 100% sick,
Exactly. And so, and then of course, if there's an HVAC system in the house, if that's built in, then making sure that there's, the appropriate type of filters that are there that are at least going to help with particulate matter, and then you can get the VOCs from the floor unit. And again, like companies like Austin Air, IQ Air, EnviroCleanse is another one that make these better quality air filters that they're not these beautiful, sexy Apple device styled air filters, but they're effective. And that's if somebody's dealing with a health issue that they can't seem to get under control, and they're moving into a new home. I think that is really important, is that there's a good quantity of activated charcoal.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, sexy kind of goes out the door when you're dealing with chronic issues.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good
And like,
question.
we, for example, all live in the Pacific Northwest region. And so we actually need to have a filter that has a good HEPA filter, because in the fall and in the summer, when we have these forest fires and that smoke comes through, that particulate matter is extremely damaging to us. And so it's important that we have something in our homes that can trap that particulate matter, and a good HEPA filter will do that. So it's this balance of grabbing the physical stuff and then having the activated charcoal to grab the volatile chemicals that aren't going to be captured by a HEPA filter.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, is when you said earlier that you want to find a true HEPA filter. So what's the difference between like a fake one?
No, there's just, it has to do with like the micron size of the capacity. What is the size of the micron that HEPA filter is going to stop?
Got
it. It's not like a true versus fake. I think they actually just call them true HEPA filters.
Oh, it's literally called true HEPA filters.
Yes, okay. I believe.
So that's what they're looking for.
Yes.
Okay. So that could potentially filter like mold spores. Maybe it just depends on how much money you're going to invest.
Yeah. And I usually don't like a mold. When you get into mold, it's different with air filters, because like an air filter is never going to solve a moldy house problem ever, ever, ever. And you're just contaminating the air filter now. And so capturing mold spores isn't the same thing as solving the problem, because the mold itself produces toxins that are volatile. And so there's like, it's layers. It's not the mold itself that's the problem. It's all the mycotoxins that they produce. Those mycotoxins, what you smell when you're smelling a musty home are VOCs. And so the HEPA filter is going to help with so it's not really.
So you got to get rid of the mold.
Yes, you absolutely have to get rid of the mold. That's like the number one thing. If there's mold, then like no air filter in the world is going to help.
Got it.
Yeah. Good point. So kind of as we wind down here, what are some good resources that people can use to start making this switch? Like, it is kind of overwhelming. You're looking at all of your products. You're like, all my cleaning products, I don't know. Right. There's no label on it. I don't know what's in it. Like, what's the best way to kind of get started making that switch?
So I really like to go for the easy. I don't want to, yes, I teach my practitioners about ingredients and labels and reading and where to go. But when we're just talking to people, they're like, oh my God, just tell me what to do. So what I recommend is kind of leaning towards a couple of different systems or platforms or resources that are available online. The Environmental Working Group has a lot of different databases that can be helpful in finding safer products in the personal care product realm and in the household cleaners realm. If you look at their EWG verified, which is not a perfect system, but it's better than 90% of the stuff that's out there, you can kind of zero in on like the A list. Like, here's the stuff that's awesome, as opposed to having to sift through everything to find, well, this one's good, but that one's bad. Like, let's just go to the list of stuff that's awesome and pick from that list, and then problem solved. And so EWG verified is one place that I like to point people. The other is Made Safe. Made Safe Certified is a third-party organization that certifies products that it doesn't have any of these sort of questionable ingredients. Made Safe is newer, so they don't have as many sort of product categories or product options under their belt. But they do have everything from personal care products to feminine care to household cleaners. So they have a good beginning selection. So those are really good resources. EWG and sort of in general has a lot of information for people. There's also websites that do a really great job of curating products. So for example, the Detox Market is my favorite place for beauty care and personal care products, and they curate dozens and dozens of brands. The landscape around personal care products in particular has changed so much. 10 years ago when I started doing this work, there was like, I could count them all on two hands. And now there's so many I can't keep track. And it's all these young people that are creating these amazing product lines in response to this issue. And so companies like the detox market does an excellent job of curating that. There's a website called Mighty Nest, which curates a lot of, I think they started really as like, baby related products, but they have a lot of really good products for household things. I really just think that if we can have a short list of places that people can go to sort of browse, there is the, what is it called? It's not My Plastic Free Life. Or maybe it is. There's a blog that somebody's been running for years on like plastic free living that has really great, here's a glass container, here's some stainless steel containers, here's some, bamboo utensils you can keep in your purse to avoid plastic on the go. So there's all of these resources that are popping up, and I think those are great. I have a small selection of curated products on my website, but it doesn't, it doesn't really compare to what, companies like the detox market do, because that's really all that they do. So I think those would be the best places to start for people so that they're not overwhelmed. I also really encourage people to just kind of do this one step at a time. And that if it takes a year or 5 years or 10 years, that's how long it takes. And it's still better than doing nothing. Is even if you're doing it slow, it's better than doing nothing. I have been in this conversation for 10 years and I only just bought a new bed 2 years ago because it was a big expensive item to swap out. And so I left it for last. I swapped out my couch 4 years ago because it also was a more expensive investment. And so I'm still making changes. I'm still, swapping things out as I have the means to do so. And so I just share that with people so that they don't think like, oh my God, I have to do everything tomorrow. You don't have to do everything tomorrow. You just need to do one thing tomorrow. And then one thing the next day.
Yeah. I wanted to ask, since you've been in this realm for 10 plus years, when you started switching everything out and, you've obviously made it a long way over those years, did you notice any changes in your health or have a personal story?
Actually I don't, because I didn't really have any health issues to begin with stepping into this work. I think a lot of people in the health space start with their own health issue that motivates them to kind of, I had autoimmune disease. Now I want to, and I, put it in remission. Now I want to help other people. I didn't have that story. I was just really pissed off about what I learned. And like, that was the thing that motivated me. And so I didn't really have any health, significant health issues that I felt shifted. I kind of wish that I had done this earlier, because I used to have like acne and skin issues, like all throughout, like all the way up until my late 30s. And I was like, what is going on? That's not cool. And, even, like that's no longer an issue for me, which is great. And so there's some small things, but I didn't really have anything, that I felt, that was what I was looking for. So for me, it just feels better up here. And I know that I'm at least reducing exposures to things that, and I've been doing it for long enough that hopefully I've been able to steer the ship away from any rocks that it might have crashed into along the way. So I don't have
peace of mind.
Yes, peace of mind is for sure. But that said, I do have, dozens and dozens of stories from clients of mine or people that have heard, advice in this realm from me on podcasts and have taken great and made big changes and experienced great shifts. And one of them, I got an email from a woman, I think this was last year, who said, she heard me on a podcast and, she's been dealing with all of these health issues, and she's a nutritionist, and she's like, I know all the things, I've done all the things, like I've studied with all the great people, I did all the herbs, I did all the tinctures, I did all the supplements, I meditate, I do this, I do that. And her main problem was that her hair was falling out like a lot. And it was just so devastating for her. And she's like, I cry every day and I just didn't know what to do. And I done everything. And she's like, and then I heard you on the podcast talking about water contamination. And I realized that 3 months prior to the start of my hair falling out, my water softener broke. And so I got a new system, and immediately my hair stopped falling out and has started growing in. And like, I just wanted to thank you. And it was just that one thing, just that one change. And it was immediate. And so, there are stories like that all the time where it's like that last 10 pounds that somebody's trying to lose. that their body's hanging on to, and they suddenly start addressing the toxins, and then that just falls off without them having to put in any effort. So there's definitely stories of that. And the one that I shared of my friend who completely changed her life around and completely reversed her infertility. And she wasn't even planning on having a third kid. It was like the accidental baby at 40 after 2 IVF kids. So like those are the kind of success stories that we see people experiencing, but it's all different because it depends on like what is happening for that individual.
Yeah,
definitely. Well, I think that is a fantastic note to end on. All of these, incredible positive potential changes that we can expect from starting to limit our exposures. And, Lara, thank you so much for being with us. You've been so informative, and I really hope people are feeling kind of, scared straight a little bit, but also inspired and empowered, and just recognizing that there are simple changes that can be made. We're not talking about like completely overhauling every single thing in your life all at once. It's a process, and doing anything is better than doing nothing. And you have to start somewhere. And so we really appreciate your expertise and your advice and encouragement, and appreciate you being on the podcast.
Well, thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much.
All right, guys, thank you so much for listening this week. We are so happy to have been able to share this with you. Lara is such a wealth of knowledge on the subject of environmental toxins, and we know you learned a ton. Even we learn something every time we re-listen to the episode. So this was definitely great. If you guys enjoyed this video, please like and share, get the word out about environmental toxins and how it affects fertility. Also, be sure to follow along with us on social media. We are on Instagram and Facebook at tinyfeet.co. And we share awesome snippets, educational quotes, and things from our day. Everything's all about fertility. So if you guys want to learn more from us, that's a great place to do it. And then, of course, interact with us and ask us your questions. We love to hear from you and spend time answering anything that you want to know.
Right. And if you are interested in working with us one-on-one, you can go to our website at tinyfeet.co, and we are accepting 20-minute phone consults right now. We're getting booked up fast, but if you would like to see if you can get scheduled in for a 20-minute free phone consult, we would love to chat with you and see how we can help you out.
And if you want to find show notes and as well as the audio and all of the links to Lara's work, you can find that on our website, tinyfeet.co/podcast, and you're looking for episode 37. We'll see you next week.